You're listening to the Tel Aviv Review here on TLV1. I am Gilad Halpern. Welcome back. I am now joined here in the studio by Dr. Susan Nashman Fraiman, who teaches art history at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and whose recent research has focused on the emergence and evolution of candle lighting practices, namely the Shabbat Lamp, among the Jews of Ashkenaz. Hello, Susan. Welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you very much.
So the interesting thing about lighting Shabbat candles is that it's not a biblically ordained religious commandment. So tell us a bit, how did it become so prevalent? And, in the first place, how did it come into being?
Well, it's basically it's a spin-off of the biblical commandment not to light fire in your homes on the Sabbath. But if you don't have fire in your homes, how do you have food? How do you have light? And from this, it's considered it's one of the additional commandments. It was initiated by the rabbis, and it appears first in Jewish writings in the Mishnah, actually, where they talk about forbidden forms of materials, and then they talk about 3 things that women die in childbirth for, and one of them is if the woman is not conscientious about lighting her Sabbath candle. So that's the first text. Actually, we have a rabbinic text that talks about it, but the custom predates it. And
so it reflects something that had already existed.
Exactly. It appears actually in Roman writers. 2 Roman writers from the 1st century mention it in a derogatory fashion, and Josephus mentions it in a positive fashion. But those are the earliest references to Sabbath lighting, so we know it's quite ancient. We know it predates a written text.
And how did it become a custom? I mean, there's something that's really functional about.
Yes,
as you said, during Shabbat you're not allowed to light fire. So how do you go about your life without fire? And was there a turn from some sort of function into something that has more value in it?
Look, that's a very good question, because actually it was a functional thing. In other words, the rabbis give 3 reasons for candle lighting. One of them is the enjoyment of Shabbat, enjoying the Sabbath. The second one is honoring the Sabbath. And the third one is domestic peace. And if there's no light at home, there's no domestic peace. So the idea really started from a functional place where the woman would light lights in all the rooms. And on the one near the table where they ate dinner, that's where she would make the blessing. And the blessing was only codified much later in the period of the Geonim. So it started out as a sort of a necessity, and then it became a commandment.
Does anybody know how it evolved into
the commandment?
Yeah.
Well, as we said, it's very ancient. It reflects a necessity because also according to Jewish law, you should live by the commandments and not die by them. So it shouldn't be the Sabbath, keeping the Sabbath should not be a punishment, right? So it has a certain logic to it that there should be light at home, and light, of course, has many positive connotations in Judaism. So the idea of light in the home, the symbolism of it and the importance of having light on the Sabbath for domestic harmony were preeminent.
Your research focuses on a much later period and a different place, that is Ashkenaz in Europe, in the late Middle Ages and early modern era. So tell us a bit about the different contexts of candle lighting in Ashkenaz as opposed to what you just told us now about the more ancient times.
Okay, well, first of all, we don't really know if there were special lamps for Sabbath lighting in the ancient period. There's one theory that such a lamp was found in Israel, but we don't have proof. We really don't know when we look at ancient lamps if they were used for the Sabbath or not. So we have testimony that lamps originally were glass lamps called in Hebrew ashashiot. They were sort of hanging glass lamps that you would fill with water and then oil on top. And they were used for lighting in general, and they would be lit for the Sabbath. But at some point, the rabbis decided there needed to be a special vessel that was distinguished just for use on the Sabbath. And that lamp...
When was that?
We have testimony that from about the 12th, 13th century.
Right, okay.
That there was a special lamp just for Sabbath lighting. Or that the woman had to extinguish the existing lamp in the house and then relight it for the Sabbath. And from there develops a special vessel for Sabbath lamp lighting. And one of the questions, or the main question of my research was really... Is the Sabbath lamp a uniquely Jewish vessel? In other words, is it just something all the communities used, a lamp like all other lamps, and the Jews just used it for the Sabbath? Or is there something that was it only used by the Jews? And so...
Okay, so here's the question. What's the answer?
The answer is it developed from a lamp that was used by nobility and in well-to-do families, but it fell out of use among the general population, probably by the Romanesque period. And the Jews continued to use it.
Which is what century?
It's about the 12th century. And then the Jews continued to use this lamp. And it started out also in synagogue, and it was transferred to the home. So something that was associated with wealth or with opulence, perhaps. And then it moved into the home as something special that was used just on the Sabbath. And so I only studied the lamps of Ashkenaz because of the certain material culture that goes with it, because the material culture has an influence on how you're going to light your home. And so that's why I didn't study the Oriental Jewish communities, for instance, because they have very different technology and very different home lighting methods. But that's an area for future research.
Can you elaborate on that a bit? What exactly it means in terms of that?
Okay. Well, first of all, in the Mishnahs, they say the best oil for lighting is olive oil. Well, olives grow in the Mediterranean, right? But olive oil is, in fact, scientifically proven the best oil. In other words, if you were going to burn some oil now to light a lamp, it burns the clearest, it doesn't smell. Now, let's say you take another kind of an oil, like camphor oil, which is actually prohibited by the Mishnah. Well, it has a very strong odor. And so you don't want something like that burning in your house on the Sabbath. Now, if you live in an Oriental Jewish community, it's no problem to have olive oil. But if you live in Northern Europe, it's more of a problem and it's more expensive. So there are different oils that people used. For instance, flaxseed oil was available. Or rapeseed oil, what we call today canola oil, was also used in Northern Europe. But in certain communities, even further north, like Poland, it gets so cold in the winter that the oil starts to become very viscous. And in those communities, they moved more toward candlelighting. In other words, there was a hanging Sabbath lamp that was very common, and it was used in northern Italy, Germany, France, parts of Poland, and also it's in Holland and England. But the more you move further north and further away from the Mediterranean, then other forms of lighting were used.
Now, in terms of the lamp itself as a commodity, was it really prevalent in all or most of the Jewish households, or was it connected to some sort of, being well off, to economic means?
Most of these lamps were made out of brass, and I wouldn't say mass-produced because they're still being made by hand, but I would say it was a fairly standard item, just like men's tefillin is a standard item. It had 6 or 8 spouts, and was as I said, made of brass. It wasn't very decorated, very minor decoration. Only very wealthy people had silver lamps. There are about 13 of these silver lamps that have survived, that are very elaborately decorated. One belonged to the Rothschild family. One's on display in the Israel Museum, for instance. But those are very, very rare. Most people had very simple, as I said, brass 6 to 8 spouts, and they were arranged in a circle like a star.
Well, what is the reason for the decline of the use of those lamps among Christians?
I don't really know the answer. I think they're not that functional. They're functional, but not enough. In other words, you can leave it burning. I did an experiment with one lamp that belongs to someone I know. It burned for about 3 hours. I guess the bigger you have, the more oil you have in it, the longer it will burn. But lighting at night is a luxury up until the modern period. So it's very interesting. And also, taking a foodstuff and burning it is also a luxury when you think about it, right? So that's one of the reasons the Romans are making fun of the Jews in the ancient period. You're doing something against really logic in a way.
And still, it wasn't associated with wealth, with social class, as it were. Even the poorer Jewish families exercised these rather upper class customs.
Yes, and according to the Talmud, in fact, if you can't have wine or if you can't have oil for lighting, you pick the oil for lighting. That's the preferable. That's the choice.
That's really interesting. Another thing that's really interesting about candle lighting is that it's a women's thing. It was done by women, which is rather rare for any type of religions, and including the Jewish one. Maybe let's take some sort of gendered perspective on this, and to what extent did this custom that, as we said, became prevalent over the years, and even the standard custom for the Jewish religion, to what extent did it serve to bolster the status of women in this?
That's a very good point. What's interesting about candle lighting is, generally speaking, according to Jewish law, women are not required in what they call the time-bound commandments. In other words, that's why women don't put on tefillin, and that's why women aren't obligated to go to prayer 3 times a day. That's why women aren't obligated to go to a minyan, because they're required to be there someplace at a certain time. But the lighting of the Sabbath candles is very much a time-bound commandment, so it's sort of an exception this way. And it's definitely considered the purview of the women. Now, there are 2 reasons. One, you could say, is negative. One is less so. But originally, it was thought that these different commandments, women were making what's called in Hebrew a tikkun, a reparation for Eve. Mm-hmm. And when Eve gave the apple to Adam, she brought death into the world. So by lighting the light, you are repairing that in a way. You're bringing, because a person's soul is compared to a light in the book of Proverbs. Mm-hmm. So by lighting the light, you are doing a reparation. So that's sort of a negative, if you will.
Is this grounded in halakha? How do you track the development of this idea?
It's in the Midrash. It's in the Midrash. It's in Bereshit Rabbah. Then it appears in the Zohar. From there, it sort of jumps over to the Zohar, and the Zohar says this. Having said that, the Zohar also goes a long way to say how important candle lighting is. And women, I don't think, took it so much in a negative sense, because there were women who wrote prayers to be said before and after candle lighting in the 18th century, who compared what the woman was doing to what the high priest did in the temple. So I think women saw it in a much more positive light. I don't think it's very interesting that that's not one of the commandments that has been attacked, let's say, by feminists. The same way you might say the family purity or things like that, those whole notions have been looked at in a very negative light. No one has looked at candle lighting that way. And I think people persist. It's a very common practice today, even to this day, I would say.
Very, very interesting, because, this is something that is perhaps the most neutral, as you say. It hasn't been attacked by feminists, and I've often wondered why.
Look, I think it's about I think it's connected to the idea that the light is beautiful, bringing light, and it's become a symbol. In other words, candle lighting moved from something very functional, as you pointed out, to something that's now a symbol. That's one commandment that has evolved over the years. We don't need the Shabbat candles to have light in our homes anymore. So it's really become a symbol of inaugurating the Sabbath and the Sabbath peace and so forth.
Now I'd like to take us to a more descriptive, perhaps, place. Tell us a bit about the actual structure of the lamp and how it evolved over the years. And again, what were the functional reasons for that?
Well, as I said, I think that the star shape did appeal to the Jewish community. And as I said, it started out as something that belonged to, gentry and royalty of sorts. So it had a very positive connotation. I think it was suitable because you could have multiple wicks that generated more light than what people usually lit their homes with. It stayed lit for a number of hours. It had sort of a reservoir. The 8-branched lamp was often used for Hanukkah lighting, actually. So it had 2 functions. It could be used for both. So, and it had a ratchet. So during the week you would lift it up, and before Shabbat you would lower it. And there was a German proverb that when the lamp comes down, the worries go up. Worries go away.
Right.
So it pretty much stayed the same. And if you look at German Jewish newspapers from the 1930s, even during the Nazi period, they're still selling those lamps.
Right.
So it was like a traditional shape, and it stayed, just like the Jews have preserved other ancient customs, like the Torah scroll, for instance, which isn't a book, but we've preserved an ancient form of a book. So here too, we've preserved sort of was preserved an ancient form of lighting well into the modern period.
Perhaps a methodological question now. To what extent were the resources that you had to rely on were damaged during the extermination of European Jewry? I'm sure that many cultural relics and documentation just disappeared.
That's a very big issue when you're studying Jewish art in general. Is that most of the things that we have survived. Maybe the 18th century is the latest, is the earliest that we have, and particularly brass, because brass was something that was confiscated at times of war, and they would use it to make weaponry. And in fact, Agnon has a story about this: how a lamp was buried by a Jewish community, so to protect it from being confiscated to be melted down, because you could make better quality brass from existing brass. Mm-hmm. They didn't really know the composition. They didn't know the scientific composition. So they would take existing brass, melt it down, and so that was one way these lamps got lost. Another way is simply through persecution. There's a famous Jewish text that was written by, I think it's called, by Nathan of Hanover, and he describes how the Jews were fleeing and all their possessions just fell off the wagons. You know, they lost all their lamps, all their things. And of course, in the 1930s, during Kristallnacht, a very beautiful lamp that was in the synagogue in Offenbach, Germany, which was a very rare silver lamp of this kind, was totally destroyed. And only part of it remains today in the Jewish Museum in New York.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is really, really fascinating, and I hope that our listeners will have the chance to further their knowledge of this rather, I would say, rather obscure, but for you, it's really the center of your life. Dr. Susan Nashman Fraiman from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Thank you very much for coming in today and for this interview.
You're very welcome.